Get to the bottom of what's truly healthy in this crazy, complex world, so you can take back what is rightfully yours. Welcome to the Health Sovereign Podcast. This is your host, Logan Christopher.
Welcome, everyone. We're here again at the Health Sovereign Podcast, and today should be a very interesting, a little bit different of an interview. We're going to diving deep. Today on the line, I have with me my good friend, Chris Plough. And as I said, diving deep. So Chris, shotgun in your mouth. How did you get to this point?
Well, so for context, I'll give just a little bit of the story, and then we'll go from there. I think there's a variety of reasons that we end up in a place. And I know for me, it was all these wounds around abandonment, around worth, specifically my natural father. And my mom had an incident early in life that really affected my nervous system, made me really fear anger, made me fear and my own worth. Like what did I do to deserve this? And later on, he chose not to be in my life. And this is really early ages. This is all before 2 years old.
Wow.
And so then it was again further like rejection, abandonment, etc. And then, where as kids, irrational stuff happens. And so when my mom got with my stepfather, there was this irrational anger and fear around why would she choose somebody else over me, right? And so all these things coalesced. And I had a pattern in my life where when I felt deeply, deeply rejected, especially by a woman, it would send me into the spiral that I didn't understand. And so I had felt so deeply wounded by the rejection of a woman and felt completely worthless, couldn't feel my own worth, and just spiraled completely out of control. And so I found myself driving out into the middle of the desert when I was 16. And I drove out through the dirt roads in New Mexico, and there was this unofficial landfill that people would drop stuff off at. And I drove up into it and pulled up next to a hill. And I had a boombox next to me, and I was playing Amazing by Aerosmith. It's an incredible song that actually means something very different to me now. But I was playing it. I slid over into the passenger side of the truck after I parked. And I pulled a shotgun, my parents' shotgun that I had stolen out of their gun cabinet. And I put the barrel in my mouth. And I took my right hand and I went down and flipped off the safety. And I took my right thumb and I put it on the trigger. And I had every intention of ending my life in that moment because I couldn't see a life worth living. I couldn't feel my own worth, and I hurt so badly. I just wanted it to end. And for whatever reason, to the depth of my soul, I wanted, well, apparently not to the depth of my soul, but to the depth of this physical being, I wanted to pull that trigger, and I couldn't. And I still remember to this day, that tastes like oily pennies. That's the taste. And I couldn't. And then I pulled it out after being there for I don't even know how long. And I felt even more worthless because not only was I a failure at all these other things in life, but I couldn't even do this. I couldn't even do this simple act. And then I drove back, entered the house. My mom and dad happened to be sitting at the table, and they were crazily concerned with where I was, what was going on, etc., because nobody knew. And I dropped the shotgun shell that I'd pulled out of the gun onto the table. And then we began to talk a little bit. So that was 16 years ago. And I didn't have peace with that until I was 39 to begin to the path out. And I didn't really feel peaceful with it until 41. So for nearly 25 years of my life, it was this cycle of depression and suicide. And I felt caught in that cycle and never really thought I would get out.
Yeah, I was just looking before the show, and suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the USA. That's a lot. I mean, we're talking about health here, and so many people focus on the physical, right? And not getting heart disease and Alzheimer's or cancer. And obviously that's very important. But since starting the show, wanted to cover really all perspectives of health. And obviously the mental and emotional is such a huge part of that.
More people take their own life, not to interrupt, but more it's fucking fascinating. More people, excuse my language. I don't even know how language goes on your show. I'll be more careful.
Let it roll. But it'll be fine. I think we can just throw an explicit marker on this.
More people take their own life than have their lives taken. It's like what a time to live in. It is a time of prosperity and abundance, but it's one in which people feel so incredibly lost. And I know and understand that feeling.
Well, and especially we look at, the irony is in the USA, right? Which should be everyone's better off than other places in the world materially, right? But we have such problems. And I never got close to suicide myself, but I think like all people, I definitely did imagine like, oh, I thought about it as an option. I never went far as planning or anything like that, but it certainly was on the table. So yeah, it's so important. And if it's the 10th leading cause of death, we definitely need to address this. So in sharing the story there, it was obvious. I think you did well as far as explaining how you felt at that time, but also why it was that way after many years of reflection and working on this.
Yeah, I think there's number one is often we're just stuck in these cycles where we don't really understand why we have these behaviors and these feelings, right? And especially when they're overwhelming, and all we can do is feel this incredible thing. For me, it's a feeling in the bones that I remember, and it continued for many years afterwards. Like sometimes I would get home and I would like pull into my house after being out with a bunch of friends or at a party, or even something that was supposedly a successful, fulfilling event in life. And I would feel so deeply alone, and I would feel it in my bones, and then my stomach would drop. And I knew what that meant. It was that similar cycle. And so my way of dealing with it for decades was I would force myself to sleep, because I knew that if I could sleep and wake up in the morning, there'd be sunlight. And in that sunlight, I'd feel a little bit better, and I'd find a way to just keep going and make it through another day. And I don't think anybody deserves to be there, man. Like truly. And there's an incredible number of causes. Like I've worked with people who have PTSD. I've worked with people who, feel worthless and unloved themselves. I've worked with people who, through a variety of reasons, feel like they're a failure because they're not living the life that they believe that they're supposed to based off of their parents or the society or their culture or whatever else. Hell, some people are just like literally just exhausted from trying to make ends meet, working multiple jobs, and just feel in this prison of financial lack, for lack of a better term. There's an incredible number of reasons that we end up in that place, but I think the place is the same. And so what's important is how can we begin to move out of that place?
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that you had this time when you were 16 years old, and for another 16 or so years longer than that, you went through these cycles. I'm curious, did you come close to it ever again, or did just sleeping on it seem to put away aim?
Yeah, there's a key moment. If it works for you, I'll share it now. Is that okay? Yep. So yeah, it continued on for actually 23 more years. That's like in the depth of it. And I was at an event. This was in January, right before my 39th birthday. And at this point, it began to change. Instead of like getting to that same depth where I'm just like, I want to end it and everything else, I literally just got to a point where I wanted not to live. And I didn't want to live because living was painful. Like living, it was like this endurance challenge and this pain that I was enduring day to day. And it was just wearing me down and grading me down. And I was done. I didn't want to kill myself, but I didn't want to live. I found that at that time, I happened to be at this event, and I decided on my 39th birthday, I'm going to do it. I'm finally just going to do it and do it for real. And I knew exactly how I was going to do it. I planned it out. I knew where I was going to go, and it was just there. And in the process of this, I began to have a bit of an emotional breakdown. And fortunately, I happened to be at this event, and I happened to be around friends, and I happened to be rooming with a very dear friend of mine. And I never really said that this is what I was going through, but lo and behold, sometimes the universe works in interesting ways. He knew what that was like. And I'm not going to share his name just because I haven't really asked his permission to do that yet. But we were rooming together, and one evening he told me a story. And he shared his story so deeply of what he'd been through and where he was now that I knew that he understood. He was the first person I really had a conversation with where I fucking knew that he understood. And then he told me what his life was like now, and what he described about his life, about, every once in a while this darkness comes, but it's not the same as before. And rather than living in it day to day or week to week or month to month, like maybe every few years it comes around, and it's less and less each time. And And it's not the same darkness. It's just a thing that comes in. It's like it's a little shadow of a cloud that passes, and life is good. And I could not imagine that, because I've at that point for 23 years have lived in this place and couldn't imagine a place out of it. But because of the depth of his story, because I could see his eyes, because I knew that he knew what I felt like, and he was a living example of what was on the other side, I decided to trust. I decided to have a bit of faith. And faith for me is a weird word, but I don't think there's anything better than that, because it's essentially a belief in something that I'd never have had actual proof of myself in my own life. And so rather than going to end my life on my 39th birthday, I made a very different decision. And the first part of that was precipitated by the fact that this gentleman sat me down and looked me in the eyes and said, I want you to have a list, and I want to be the first person on your list. And whenever you get to this place, I don't care when it is, I don't care what time it is, I don't care what's going on, you're going to call me. And of course, people have said things like that before, but it was the first time it like really reached into my soul and I felt it. And my integrity is so strong that like, okay, if I promise that, I'm going to do it, even though it's the last thing in the world that I want to do. And so he ended up being the first person on my list. And then the decision I made was I'm going to go around and I'm going to talk to everybody close to me, and I'm going to share what I had been experiencing for the last, 2.5 decades. And the first person was my grandmother. And so rather than going to end my life on my birthday, I went and drove up to my grandmother, and I surprised her. She didn't know I was coming. And I sat down with her and my aunt, and I shared exactly what I'd been going through for the last part of my life. And it was such a release and shame. Like I didn't realize there was so much darkness and so much shame there. In doing that, I told her the story of this friend who had helped me. And, I mentioned the list, and I didn't think anything of it. And it always gets me. Like she demanded to be on that list, like demanded. It wasn't even an ask. And then every person I went to thereafter, it was the exact same story. And it was easier to tell each time, and the shame was less each time. And I realized more and more people, as I began to share this, they began to share that they had gone through similar things. And like I didn't feel alone anymore. And then this list grew. And then by the end of it, I had this list of like 11 people who felt my life was worth more than I did. And it was proof, man. Even in those times in the darkness to come back, like I couldn't refute this list. It was physical proof that whatever I was feeling and experiencing was not real. It was all within my head, and it was all like clouded and everything else. And both talking about it, releasing the shame, and the creation of the list were the path out for me.
Mm-hmm. Wow, I'd never heard that part of the story. That's quite amazing. What I want to ask is, was with your friend at this event in January, the first person on your list, was he the first time you had really shared this stuff before? I mean, you mentioned before, after the initial story with the shotgun, you talked to your parents about some stuff, but for that 20 years, did you never really let people in for the most part?
I didn't. I had grown up with this identification, this belief that the world is unsafe and that the only person I could really depend on was myself. Mm-hmm. And so in times of turmoil, my automatic reaction, and I still have a tendency towards this way, my automatic reaction is to pull into myself as opposed to reach out to others. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I had never shared that story before then. And even with that first person, I didn't share everything with him, not to begin with. Like he just saw enough of it that he took the first step, and I was very fortunate with that. And then that allowed me, because of what he shared in the space, the vulnerability that he created, it allowed me to step into it and share more than I'd ever felt comfortable before.
Were you surprised that he too had similar experiences? Were you thinking like, oh, I'm the only person that's ever had this before?
Dude, it's the weirdest experience because there's a lot of similarities in life that he and I have. Mm-hmm. And I was both completely surprised. I think my mind was completely surprised, but like my heart, like there was something in me that knew that. There was something in me that felt that simpatico, that felt that resonance. And so it was so weird that I was like flabbergasted and not surprised at the same time.
Yeah. And you mentioned the word shame, and I think that's a big part of why you kept it hidden for so long, but also the same thing that would stop a person from sharing it in the first place. But as you shared it, you were saying that you're releasing the shame around it, and it just felt so much better. Could you go in a little bit further on that? Because I do feel that is a key piece. And I know even when I do have issues, like I don't always share directly with my wife, even though if I did do that, it would make it better instantly. And I know this cognitively, but for whatever reason, we get in these loops in our head, and it may be a minor thing or maybe a life-altering, life-changing thing like this.
Yeah, I think that we experience several corrosive emotions. And in my particular worldview, in my particular experience, I don't know if any is as corrosive as shame. And I've heard it described as this once before, like guilt is feeling bad for, something you've done, and shame is feeling bad for who you are. And so like there's this inherent feeling and belief in yourself that A, whatever it is that's going on, you deserve it. And B, you're not worthy of anything more. And C, that nobody else would understand. And D, that you are alone in this experience. And that just furthers this spiral of isolation, right? And so you never end up breaking out of it because of all of these beliefs. Nobody else understand. This is my own personal experience, et cetera. And because of that, the one thing that literally, like telling the story and going out and sharing with people what I'd been through, I'll tell you right now, it was the hardest thing that I had ever done in my life to that point. And I've driven a motorcycle in the middle of winter to Siberia. I've slept outside in minus 42 degrees. I've done some things in my life. And this was the hardest thing that I'd ever done. And it was literally the most freeing. So what happens is I've come to like experience it is we have this shame, and the shame is like this dark fog. It's like this black fog that's all around us that obscures our vision, keeps us from feeling the things that we're feeling, keeps us from connecting to others. And literally just by talking and sharing the story of these things that go on to somebody who will sit there and listen, it's as if like there's this light that comes in and the fog begins to evaporate. Like, because it's nothing, it's ethereal, it's not even real, right? But it feels so solid and opaque that you just get lost in it. And so when that begins to dissolve, like this light comes in and you realize like this darkness wasn't an all-encompassing darkness. It's not a solid thing. It's not this like huge blackness that I can't get out of. It's just a fog. And literally the fact of sharing it every time, it lessened and lessened and lessened and lessened until I got to the point where it's like, I don't feel shameful about this. I don't feel shameful about it at all. And matter of fact, the number of people as I go like, I've never told anybody this, and would share their story. And not just of, okay, I've had those conversations or I've had those feelings or anything else, but literally I've had several people who have been like, so here's the funny thing. I've been to that edge. My one friend was like, I've literally had this bag of inert gas and I was just about ready to put it over my head because that was the easiest way that I could imagine out of this. And somebody knocked on my door. And another one's like, I was literally standing on the ledge of a building and I thought I was going to fall forward, and I ended up falling backwards and fell onto the floor of the building. Right. And like the number of people who've been to that place. And I'm like, we're not alone. Like we're not alone. We never have. And it's an illusion. I don't even know why I'm censoring myself at this point. I've already cussed. It's an illusion that we are, right? And that was one of the more healing things, to the point where, and I hope I'm not skipping too far forward or missing anything, but that happened at 39. And I continued for months and months and months to talk to people, everybody close to me. I just had the deep conversation with. And by the time I was midway through my 41st year, right? So about 2.5 years later, I ended up traveling down through New Mexico, and I went to that same spot in the desert. I was literally in that same spot in the desert. And I sat down to meditate, and the sun was coming up. And as the sun rose, like, okay, I'm going to feel this. This was a big point in my life. All right, I'm going to feel this, and this isn't going to be easy, but I'm going to endure it. And as the sun rose, man, like all I felt was peace. Like all I felt was peace. And there was none of that darkness or that blackness or anything else there. And then all I could feel was love, like literally love and gratitude for that 16-year-old who had this incredible strength not to pull that trigger. And so I just meditated and I sent love back to that kid. And it was like the last of the shadow had just been released. And I literally, and I'm not saying this for effect, I'm just saying this to be honest, I literally have not, I'm now 43 years old, I literally have not feared or worried about suicide again. And, I can't say what the experience of my life is going to be from here. I would never claim that because I don't think anybody understands that. but I don't have any fear of it whatsoever. And it's a fascinating experience to move from something that was so all encompassing, so deep that I could never imagine being out of it, to literally being on the other side of an experience and almost having difficulty imagining what that was to be within it. It's like waking up from a dream.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask about, I guess, the courage to share with other people. So you had this person that had that sympathetic resonance. He had similar experiences, and you also saw that he had turned it around in some way, some fashion. So you had faith, as you mentioned, that it was possible and it would be possible for you for whatever reason you felt this at this time. But as you said, like, to go and have this discussion with further people, to many people, that would actually be a worse fate than death. Right? And I'm sure that crossed your mind.
That way.
Right?
Yeah.
Even though, like, it's a conversation, like it shouldn't be like that, but it feels like that.
It feels like life or death.
Yeah.
Yes.
Is there anything else that, because and I'm sure other people that may be in that place or have been in that place that felt that same. When you're depressed, right, it feels like it's all pervasive, that it's going to last forever, even though that's generally not the case. So how do you make that first step?
Yeah, it's fascinating. Like, things like that in my life, especially at that time, like when I would step into a conversation like that, I would feel literal fight or flight. Like, adrenaline would dump. My vision would tunnel. My hearing would get kind of tinny. Like, I would literally experience a full-on fight or flight trigger, right? Wow. And it was so hard because when that happens, then it becomes really hard to think, right? All you can do is, like, you're there in the moment and your body's just like, do I run? Do I hide? Do I fight? Like, that's all that's going on. And the things that really, really helped me with it is, one, I started with somebody who I knew loved me more than anything. Like, damn, I love my grandmother. There was a part of me that knew that this was the safest possible place that I could, like, do this with first. I didn't start with a place that I had other fears and stuff around, and that was really helpful. The other part about it is, I had done things in my life where I'd experienced that physical danger in different ways. And so I wasn't, like, this feeling of adrenaline dump wasn't unknown to me. It was just in a different context. Like, I'd gone bungee jumping. I've done other things before. Mm-hmm. And I'd learned, like, from bungee jumping that literally, if I just keep, even though, like, full adrenaline dump and everything else, if I just keep stepping down this plank and then just step off of it, it's going to happen, right? Mm-hmm. So my focus is just one step, next step, next step, next step, next step, next step. And so I've just had trained myself that literally in that moment, rather than worrying about anything, all I do is, what is the next step? What is the next step? What is the next step? Okay, ring my grandmother's door. Okay, say hi. Okay, walk in. Okay, say, I'd like to talk to you. Okay, sit in the chair in the living room. You know, like, literally step by step, and then just begin it. And then the third was breathing. Like, literally, and I've learned this through meditation. I've learned this through mindfulness. I've learned this in a lot of ways. In that moment, there's a particular breathing, and you'll know this better than I do, but I've just found it helpful. Like, there's a certain breathing, box breathing, that I believe was also taught to soldiers back in World War II and all throughout time. And in those super traumatic moments, like, you breathe in for 4 seconds, you hold it for 4 seconds, you release it for 4 seconds, and you hold it for 4 seconds. And you continue. And that is a way of telling the body that you are actually safe regardless of what it's experiencing. And it begins to calm the body, and it begins to bring, blood flow back to the brain, and you begin to be able to process. And that has been insanely useful to me multiple times in my life.
Mm-hmm. So during this time, from when you were that initial suicide attempt to 39, when you had this change, like, you became a very successful entrepreneur, business person, right? Like, to the outside world, you were on cloud 9, right?
Yeah, well, that can, like, add to the isolation a bit as well at times, but it was also, I'm very fortunate for it. So I learned early on that for me, like, one of the ways that I could get attention and some of the stuff that I craved was achievement. And man, was I good at achieving, like, and I love learning. Like, I've always had this beautiful innate curiosity, and I love to learn anyways. I had succeeded in a lot of realms in life. I was, an incredible student and had done really well there. I learned to do construction and was incredibly good with that. I had learned computer architectures and computer engineering and had, worked with a startup and, achieved honors within that. I had moved into the realm of theater and had won many, many awards for theater. I started a company and grew it from 0 to 8 figures over the course of a few years and into a global company, everything else. So like to the outside world, like Mr. Plough, Chris had his shit down and he was living the life. And I was also like, because I was not always happy with my life, I would do reckless things, but people on the outside wouldn't view that as reckless. Like he doesn't care about his life. They'd be like, dude, he's so fearless, and dude, he's adventurous, and look at all the stuff that Chris gets to do. But I was using that to try to fill a hole that could never be filled at the time. And I was using that to put forth this facade of perfection, this facade of achievement, so that I could try to feel good about myself. And there were parts of it that I really enjoyed as well. Like there were times in there I was having an incredible time. There were times that I was really doing what I wanted to do, but there was a lot of it that I just felt insanely alone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the achievement could only momentarily make you feel good, but as you said, it can't fill a hole if at your core you don't believe you're worth living, right?
Yeah. And if you like keep running at that speed, like what I was doing essentially is I was taking what is essentially, a journey or a marathon, i.e. life, and I was turning it into a sprint. And so I was literally sprinting every day. And it's no wonder that like between like this depression and suicide that I was experiencing and feeling worn down by that, by not really putting attention into relationships and openness and connection and fulfillment in life and all the things that would normally fill me up, and by running at this sprint speed for so long, it was inevitable that I would essentially have a complete burnout because there was nothing left in the tank. And then when there was nothing left in the tank, that's when I got to the point of, oh crap, I can't do this anymore. And fortunately that for me eventually came about, and great, here's a whole new path and we've got to try something completely different because the old patterns are obviously not working. I'd done it for so long, but it was a dangerous place to go in because it could have very, very easily, without the right influences, without that moment with that beautiful friend, it could have gone the exact opposite way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for listening. We'll be back next week to conclude with Chris Plough as we dive into the transformative psychotechnologies that Chris has used, and also I myself have used, to make big changes in life. So stay tuned. At Lost Empire Herbs, we guarantee our herbs will change your life or your money back. More energy, mental focus, better sleep, sex, hormones, workouts, and more. Unlike the vast majority of supplements out there, with us you can notice a feelable difference to perform at your peak, or you don't have to pay for them. That's what performance herbalism is all about. Get started by going to lostempireherbs.com and take our new quiz to find the right herbs for you.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.